The Senate just delivered a devastating blow to Donald Trump's economic agenda, tearing apart his so-called big, beautiful bill and leaving Republican leadership reeling. In a surprise ruling, the Senate parliamentarian determined that major portions of the bill broke long-standing Senate rules and would have to be stripped out if Republicans want to pass it through budget reconciliation. And what exactly was removed? Some of the most extreme and dangerous provisions, parts of the bill that critics say would have hurt ordinary Americans while rewarding billionaires and big corporations. One provision would have completely shut down the agency that protects people from scams by banks, credit card companies, and payday lenders. Another would have slashed support for the very workers who help keep the financial system stable. It even targeted climate protections, gutting clean air rules and letting polluters off the hook. And in a bizarre...
Donald Trump is absolutely unhinged, and he is plunging America straight down the toilet. Not only is Trump delusional, but he's facing blow after blow. That's right. The U.S. Senate has just dropped an explosive and devastating bombshell on Donald Trump, and it has his entire administration absolutely panicking. Now, first of all, let's not pretend that Trump's mental issues are somehow a secret. People spend so much time yapping about Biden when in reality, Trump is now the president. And he is showing countless signs of mental decline.
The president. I never saw anything in Joe Biden that made me wonder whatsoever. And it's not that I was with Joe Biden every single day, that's for sure. But as I talked about my grandparents, the way that I would describe Joe is like, I mean, he's a granddaddy, right? And so, like, you know, the way that my granny was when she was younger versus ultimately kind of where she was at 81 when she ended up passing away, mentally she was still there, but like her attitude about certain things, like whether or not she was looking to be as polished or cared to be as polished, or even if she moved as fast, it just wasn't there. We all slow down. But I will tell you that I will take a broken, or however they want to describe Joe Biden, over Donald Trump any given day. Because number one, I know Joe Biden's heart. And I can tell you that when you look at the legislation that he was able to push forward with, this wasn't legislation that was about him and his rich friends. It was legislation that was for the good of the American people. And when you look at the people that he surrounded himself with, even if you're saying that there was a mentally deficient Joe Biden, I know that he absolutely had a mental acuity that is supreme when it comes to comparing him to Donald Trump, because at least he kept good people around him. He kept people that would keep us safe in this country. He kept people that would make sure that even as tensions were rising all around the world, that we were keeping those tempered. He was able to understand with his level of mental acuity who our friends were. He was not getting us into unwarranted tariff wars and things like that. So even if we want to say, which I refuse to accept, that Joe Biden was mentally deficient, let me tell you something. His mental deficiency is still 1,000 times better than what we currently have. And so, you know, I just wish that ultimately this country would judge each of our leaders with the same measuring stick. We do not. There was a lot of pressure that was put on Joe Biden. There were a lot of criticisms that were lodged at him, as well as Kamala Harris.
Of course, Donald Trump is also being ridiculed repeatedly on live TV.
Donald Trump gets dementia. How will we know? Donald Trump's mental decline, which is more and more obvious, started from such a low level of mental processing power that it's hard to track his decline. It's from low to lower. And then there are days like today when Donald Trump asks himself out loud in public if he is allowed to appoint himself chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, it may be tiresome to hear, but we must not grow weary of making the point that no other president was ever capable of saying anything as stupid or as indicative of dementia as that. am I allowed to appoint myself chair of the Federal Reserve? And we must not grow weary of reminding ourselves what the White House press corps would have done if Joe Biden ever said anything like that, and how big the headlines would be in the next day's print editions of the New York Times and the Washington Post and every newspaper in the country. Because if we grow weary of making the point of how singularly stupid and possibly clinically demented Donald Trump's statements are, then we will become part of the normalization process of those statements, which most of the American news media has unwittingly participated in, and 14-year-olds in this country will think it's perfectly normal for a president to say those things. And on a day when the President of the United States is reportedly in a meeting in the Situation Room where he is trying to decide how much to support or fully join a war that he opposed a week ago, it must be reported as part of that very same story that the person who is supposed to be in charge in that Situation Room meeting, the person who is supposed to be the decider in chief, as George W. Bush put it, in that meeting doesn't know if he can appoint himself chair of the Federal Reserve, and some of the highest ranking people in that room with that president also don't know the answer to that question. Pete Hegseth has no idea if Donald Trump can appoint himself chair of the Federal Reserve. Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump have no idea that Donald Trump doesn't even have the legal power to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, and he also doesn't have the power to unilaterally replace the chair of the Federal Reserve because it requires a confirmation vote by the United States Senate. That's how small the brain is that is sitting at the head of the table in the Situation Room deciding just how much the United States of America should participate in the war between Israel and Iran, that Donald Trump all but promised his voters could not possibly occur on his watch. In fact, that's exactly what he promised. Donald Trump spent his entire presidential campaign saying Vladimir Putin would not have dared to launch a full-scale war against Ukraine if Donald Trump had been president. Donald Trump spent his entire presidential campaign claiming that Hamas would not have dared to attack Israel on October 7th, 2023. Donald Trump promised no wars if he got elected president. Donald Trump promised would solve and end Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. On the first day of his presidency, Donald Trump promised he would bring peace to the Middle East, the entire region. On the first day of his presidency, and then once in the White House, Donald Trump began promising White Lotus-style beach resorts in Gaza. And if that is not a sign of dementia in a 79-year-old man, then it is at minimum proof that Donald Trump has no idea what he's talking about whenever he talks. If Donald Trump gets dementia, how will we know? I asked that question on Twitter a week before Donald Trump's first inauguration as president. I asked that question before.
But none of the mockery shook Donald Trump quite like the U.S. Senate did. That's right. The Senate just dropped a devastating bombshell on Donald Trump. Take a look.
The Senate just delivered a devastating blow to Donald Trump's economic agenda, tearing apart his so-called big, beautiful bill and leaving Republican leadership reeling. In a surprise ruling, the Senate parliamentarian determined that major portions of the bill broke long-standing Senate rules and would have to be stripped out if Republicans want to pass it through budget reconciliation. And what exactly was removed? Some of the most extreme and dangerous provisions, parts of the bill that critics say would have hurt ordinary Americans while rewarding billionaires and big corporations. One provision would have completely shut down the agency that protects people from scams by banks, credit card companies, and payday lenders. Another would have slashed support for the very workers who help keep the financial system stable. It even targeted climate protections, gutting clean air rules and letting polluters off the hook. And in a bizarre twist, the bill included language to punish the military, if it didn't submit paperwork on time. Something lawmakers from both parties quietly admitted made no sense. Senator Elizabeth Warren called the ruling a huge win for consumers and for basic sanity, adding, "This bill was a reckless, dangerous attack on working families. It would have let powerful corporations cheat and pollute without consequences. Democrats fought back, and we're not done fighting." Senator Jeff Merkley echoed that sentiment, saying, "As much as Senate Republicans would prefer to throw out the rule book and advance their families lose and billionaires win agenda, there are rules that must be followed, and Democrats are making sure they are." Outside Capitol Hill, progressive groups cheered the decision. The advocacy group Public Citizen said in a statement, "Trump's bill was a Trojan horse for corporate greed. Stripping out these provisions is a victory for every American who doesn't want to be scammed, poisoned, or ignored by their own government." Even some moderate Republicans have gone silent in the wake of the ruling, avoiding questions about the bill's future. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who would have the power to overrule the parliamentarian, has already signaled he likely won't. Doing so would set a dangerous precedent that could be used against Republicans in the future. The backlash to Trump's bill was already fierce, with public opinion polls showing strong opposition from across the political spectrum. Critics have called it one of the most unpopular economic proposals in recent memory, an attempt to gut consumer protections, weaken environmental safeguards, and dismantle financial oversight, all while offering massive giveaways to the ultra-wealthy. With the ruling, the bill's most dangerous parts are now dead, at least for now. But the fight isn't over. Democrats warn that if even a watered-down version of this legislation passes, it could still do serious damage. "The good news is we've stopped some of the worst parts," said Warren. "The bad news? Trump and his allies will be back, and we have to stay ready."
This is brutal news for Donald Trump. This is amazing news for America. The Republicans really do have an agenda where families lose and billionaires win. It's despicable, deplorable. It's Trump, if you want to support that. As always, you can hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and if you stuck around to the end, drop a blue heart in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.